Hello, my name is Pelin. I'd like to welcome you all to our program that we prepare as Istanbul Policy Center, Sabancı University Stiftung Mercator Initiative in collaboration with Medyascope. Today we will be talking about Afghanistan in transition and its implications for Turkey. After almost 20 years with the ending of the US-led coalition in Afghanistan, and as of September, what do we see on the ground? What is the situation in Afghanistan? What are the major concerns of the population? What is the situation about the people who are fleeing Afghanistan? And when we look at it from the Turkish point of view, what are the implications of Afghan refugees for Turkey? And also, we are going to look at the triple effect of Turkey's relations with the West coming from the refugees. I have two guests today, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. First of all, I'd like to introduce Karolina Augustova. She was our former fellow, a fellow of 2020-21, Mercator IPC fellow, and she worked on impacts of EU's externalization politics on migrants' mobility at Turkey-Iran border. And her project is quite relevant to our topic for today as well. And we have also our other former fellow, Magdalena Kirchner. She's now the country director of Afghanistan at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and she was a former fellow of Mercator IPC Fellowship Program from 2016. And she's also expert in conflict research, foreign policy analysis in the context of international crisis management. So, she has also observations from Afghanistan, and she had an experience from the ground. We are very lucky to have both of you today with us. Thank you very much for joining to our program. Maybe first of all, we can start with Magdalena, if it's okay. We can look at the situation in Afghanistan today. And what is the situation? What can you tell us about the Taliban's second rule, which has just begun in Afghanistan? What kind of a government rule that we could expect? What are the first signs? I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Pelin. Thank you for the invitation to IPC. It's really nice to be back, although only virtually, of course. And thank you for picking up this topic. I think it's not only quite relevant, but it's also relevant to Afghanistan-Turkish relations and to the EU observing this relationship as something that could be quite critical for how the EU is actually designing its answer to the challenges that the situation in Afghanistan poses. So thank you. And maybe let me just start with a quick overview of where do we stand after what we internally sometimes call T-Day, the 15th of August of this year, where the president and the most members of the Afghan political and military leadership fled the country. We were, on the one part, of course, relieved that we didn't see the pictures of Kabul turning into a Sarajevo, urban fighting for many months that we were concerned in the months before. But still, it is a very disorganized and uncoordinated transfer of power that we saw. And since August 15, the Taliban are de facto the ruling force in the country. They have started in early September to also form a caretaker government. They have since then appointed more and more people. So they have shown their willingness and interest to rule the country, to become the legitimate government of Afghanistan, internationally recognized. But as you said, it is a transition. And of course, it's not quite easy for the Taliban to establish themselves. And that is, due to the first fact that they inherited a quite complicated situation, which they obviously also have a lot of responsibilities for. Just if we remember the first half of the year, the number of casualties, people dying from conflict or being injured or being displaced reached unprecedented levels in Afghanistan. Never before had so many people died in the war. And we had hundreds of thousands of people who fled within the country. And as Karolina will tell us, of course, many of them chose to leave Afghanistan behind. The reason for this is the war. Another reason is, climate change also hits Afghanistan. There is a massive drought in the first half of the year that basically also deprived Afghanistan of harvest. So many people who live from agriculture had to leave. Fear now starvation. According to UN estimates, the number of people who are suffering from food insecurity and children who are malnourished is extremely high. And the economy was not only in a very bad position, it was also super important, super dependent on external conditions. Afghanistan imports most of its medical supplies, a lot of food, commodities from the outside, from neighboring countries, from international other countries. And the vast majority of its state budget comes from international aid, which basically came to a halt on August 15th. So that means that the government, the Taliban government, faces an economic crisis. They don't have access to the assets of the Afghan banks. They basically collapsed in mid-August. It's very difficult for Afghans to even get money from the banks. So they don't have the instruments that a state would generally have to mitigate the crisis, which could mean that the economic crisis that Afghanistan faces could become a humanitarian crisis every second, and that needs to be addressed by an international community that is very reluctant to continue development aid with Afghanistan and cooperation. And the last point that we see is that although the security situation has improved significantly, because one of the most violent conflict parties, the Taliban themselves, have basically stopped fighting, as there was no one in their way anymore. We do hear, of course, reports of displacement, forced displacement, of targeted killings and attacks. But there is a very difficult transition from the Taliban as a war movement or a war party whose only governance role was to recruit and to feed fighters into a government that actually can provide for the majority of the people. The previous government obviously failed to do this, but the Taliban right now are pretty badly equipped to actually provide for the people under their rule, and that puts the Afghans on the ground into a very difficult situation.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, for portraying this picture for us at the moment. And we can see that with the massive drought and the conflict, there are many people fleeing the country. We have seen the footage of people trying to leave the Kabul airport. And at the same time, we had experiences of Afghan people fleeing the country also beforehand. And now maybe we can turn to Karolina and talk about the Afghans fleeing the country and arriving to Turkey. What is the situation about the Afghan refugees in Turkey? Because this is not a new phenomenon, but do we see an influx of people coming in Turkey after the current developments? What are your observations? Because you have also done an extensive field work in the Turkish-Iran border in Van. You stayed there, so you had many experiences with the population who has crossed the border, and the population living in Van, receiving these people. So could you please share your experiences with us and observations with us, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to speak alongside Magdalena and follow the points that she already pointed out what's happening in Afghanistan. And I think it's really good to focus on the Iran-Turkey border, which has not been discussed until recently, until the recent changes in Afghanistan. However, what I want to point at the beginning is that this border has been used by Afghans since the 1980 Soviet-Afghan War and by other nationals for a very, very long time. So this is not a new thing, right? So Afghans have been migrating to and across Turkey towards the west, across the Iran-Turkey border for a very long time. What is the new, really, what we see is something that is fear of the new migration crisis. So, for example, the European Union has been calling for further externalization policies, such as redelegating responsibility over migration and border controls towards non-EU zones, especially Turkey. But Turkey, of course, counteracts and says, well, we're hosting the largest refugee population worldwide, including around 300,000 Afghans. And we don't want to be Europe's refugee warehouse. So at the end of the day, really, there has been these clashes and fears over what's going to happen and fears of migration crisis, which we observed similar to what we observed in 2015. To this end, Turkey sent more troops to its eastern border with Iran, but also it deployed coast guards in the Van Lake, which has been used as a major smuggling point for people when they are crossing from the east of Turkey towards the west. But also there has been this huge idea to show the world that this border is not possible to pass. But really, again, when we are looking at broader picture, like the Iran-Turkey border has been militarized since the 1980s, since Turkey's beginning of the fight against terrorism, namely PKK. So this militarization, again, it's not something new. Also, when we talk about EU-Turkey migration cooperation, most of the focus is dedicated to western borders between Greece and Turkey. However, maybe later on we can speak about the macro, what's happening within international relations, that 2015 agreements, the March 2016 deal also impacted the border management in eastern Turkey. But these calls for externalizations and fears of migration really contrast to what we can see on the ground, the reality, what's happening on the ground. So the Turkish Minister of Interior reported that 110,000 people tried to cross border from Iran to Turkey without authorization in 2021, which around 46,000 people have been Afghans. However, it can seem like a large number. However, if we compare it to, for example, the year 2019, almost 500,000 tried to cross this border. So this number is nothing really too huge in comparison to the previous years, especially to the years before COVID-19 pandemic, when the borders were much more possible for refugees. So, but at the end of the day, also, Afghans constitute what the state authorities call the largest irregular migrant group, which is transpassing from Iran to Turkey. But let me just state or really highlight that most of the time Afghans lack legal access to border crossing and safe and legal passage. Of course, we have observed in Afghanistan tremendous efforts by international community to evacuate people from Afghanistan, especially those who were cooperating with international forces and with European states, the US Army, and so on. However, most Afghans are so-called left behind, and these people were left behind, or there has been always threat by the Taliban, among other factors that Magdalena pointed out a few minutes ago. So these people have no other chance than often cooperate with smugglers and cross border irregularly and move towards the west. But when we speak about these journeys and how people actually cross these borders, it's really important to say that the geographical area between Iran and Turkey consists of mountainous regions. Some of the mountains are high 3,800 meters. And in the winter, it can be minus 40 Celsius degrees. So if you cross, or if people try to cross this border in the winter, what I observed in January, or what I encountered in Van when I was conducting research there, was that many people freeze to death while border crossing, or they are subjected to such a tough weather that they, even if they manage to arrive, they have severe frostbites and their limbs are being amputated. These journeys can be really traumatic. Also in the summer, when the weather is really hot and people face physical exhaustion. So this is one thing that is really difficult to navigate. Another thing is that, as I said, Turkey has been fighting terrorists namely PKK, in this region. So this border is basically full of military zones. And with my interviews, or during my interviews with Jandarma, the border patrols, they said that they can basically shoot anyone if they have a suspicion that these people are potential PKK members. So refugees are passing these military zones. And most recently, what we observed at the Iran-Turkey border are pushbacks, which is not anything new, because pushbacks have been encountered especially along the EU's physical borders, when the state authorities are forcing refugees over border to Iran without considering their individual circumstances, such as, for example, applying for protection. And the anonymous source that I received recently said that the Turkish Ministry of Interior reported to push back around 90,000 people in 2000 and this year, basically 2021. And I think this is quite a significant number, but we have to say that Turkey is really facing limited opportunities to host people, to resettle them. And there has been a huge pressure on Turkish authorities not to let anyone pass. Yes. And increasingly, of course, people rely more on smugglers, because to navigate increased militarized borders, border checkpoints, patrols, geographic landscape, that is really tough. People are reliant on people from the local region who understand their geography and the border controls, and pay them thousands of euros to cross this border and manage to arrive in Turkey or move further to the EU.
Thank you very much, Karolina. Maybe we can talk about this further also in the next round as well, when we talk about more about Turkey-EU relations within the context of refugees in a macro level. Magdalena, maybe we can talk about a little bit of the current concerns maybe on the ground in Afghanistan, what the people are expecting to see, and how they live their life is changing. Is it going to be back? Is it going to be the same as it was when Taliban was in power in the 1990s? Are there going to be limitations, or what kind of a role that we're going to be seeing in Afghanistan, and how is that going to affect especially the vulnerable population, women, children? What are your comments on it?
Yeah, thank you, Pelin. I think so far it's difficult to get like a uniform picture. I mean, the Taliban were a governing reality of Afghanistan before August 15th, so they had already taken territory in the past years, and they also practiced some kind of basic governance also in these areas, where they focus on security and on providing justice and quick justice, and maybe some of these harsh punishments that we know from like movies or reports in the 1990s, but a lot in rural areas. This is a tremendous change. Now we see Taliban governing areas, or being in charge of governing areas that they did not set foot in that position in 20 years, especially in Kabul, in Herat, in big cities. You can really see like the problems, say, to adjust, which also means that there are like more violent encounters. I think a lot of people have followed the situation of journalists and female protesters being hit, being beaten by Taliban, who have, well, let's say, whose default reaction to these kind of dissent is violence and repression. But of course, in other areas where the local ideas of the constituencies are more close or more familiar with what the Taliban's thought in that area is, there we don't see much of a change, because there is, I mean, quite the opposite. I mean, there is actually an improvement of the situation because the fighting has stopped. I think overall, we can observe that there are some remnants also in the rhetoric. I think one issue that is quite upsetting to a lot of like women rights activists and international observers is that the logic that the Taliban use, for instance, when they deprive women of a return to their workplace. A lot of women worked in government offices. A lot of women worked, obviously, in NGOs, in banking, in the private sector. They were now, so far, not let back into the work, which is a real problem because a lot of them are single breadwinners and they have to provide for their families. It's not just a hobby for them to go to work, with the argument that it's not safe yet. And once it will be safe, then women can go back to work. The same argument they use for denying girls the access to secondary education. So far, girls in secondary education have not been called back to school. Their boys have. And that the argument that it's not safe enough, so it will have to be postponed to a later stage, that is certainly something that reminds many people of the same argumentation in the 1990s, and where the Taliban actually do have an interest and would push for this condition to change, to create maybe a second school building or something like this, or would they just use it as an excuse to deny women their spot? Certainly, we have seen a lot of regression on female participation in public spaces. Of course, a lot of female politicians have had to leave the country. Some are still in the country and then hiding. Female journalists feel their spaces are closing. And what was, although under the protection, of course, of a lot of international engagement during the previous administration, the sense of a natural right at the table, although it was still fragile for the women in the Islamic Republic, I think that has been lost to an extent. So women voices in Afghanistan have been kind of silenced, but there is, of course, a very strong diaspora, a lot of women who are actively asking for support, who still speak out, who are trying to raise the concerns. And I wish that among international partners, there is also more awareness for this. As I said before, I think, of course, there are many Afghans who resent the political and societal visions of the Taliban. A lot of them, as Karolina said, had left or are still trying to leave. There's still many people who are waiting to be evacuated, who are seeking a way out. But it should be really emphasized that part of it is that it's nearly impossible, even for those who would say, I could adjust myself to life under the Taliban. It's impossible if the economic situation does not improve, because hundreds of thousands of government workers are out of jobs. They don't receive the salaries. People who work for NGOs do not receive enough money to feed their children. You see in Kabul the scenes on the street of people selling basically everything, not because they want to move, but because they just lack a basic income. With the winter coming, in the summer, we observed next to our office the World Food Program feeding IDPs in Kabul. Now it's more for normal Afghans to say so. It's usual. It's become a normal situation to get money, to get food by humanitarian organizations. So the overall economic situation is so depressing that even for the people who could maybe imagine making compromises with the Taliban, it will be unbearable. And as Karolina said, this is, of course, a good business for smugglers. All neighboring countries have been, well, maybe much better than the EU, been preparing for this new 2015 situation. There has been a lot of fencing. There have been arrangements between Taliban and neighboring countries regarding these issues. And it's become very difficult for Afghans to actually leave the country, even illegally. The prices for smugglers have gone up. We have seen in the past weeks a lack of even getting access to a passport. Now the passport office has been reopened, but that means that you see hundreds of people lining up to get a visa to Iran. And that is not only the threat of the Taliban rule, that is the desperation of the people. And maybe a last point on what also Karolina said, in the past years, one of the main partners for Turkey, but also for other countries that thinking about returning Afghan refugees to Afghanistan, were embassies. Now with this, like the Taliban government being basically in diplomatic limbo, so all the embassies are still staffed by representatives, ambassadors, and staff affiliated with the old government, not being able to issue new passports, it will be very difficult for states that want to return Afghans to do that legally. And that, I think, is my concern and fear, that the number of pushbacks will actually increase because there is no legal way for countries that want to deport Afghans to do that, even when they don't care about the basic human rights of these people, to do it in a legal manner, because there is no instrument outside of Afghanistan to do that legally.
Thank you very much for pointing out these important things that we cannot even see, that these are major concerns that also we have to take into consideration. And maybe, Karolina, can you also talk about this gender aspect within the migration and the stories that you have seen, Afghans arriving in Turkey? How does gender play a role within the migration, and how our women are affected within these journeys?
Yeah, so just before I do so, I just want to quickly just say that I fully agree with Magdalena about pushbacks, right? Because I think that from my comparative interviews, it's obvious that pushbacks are not new, even at the Iran-Turkey border, but right now they skyrocketed because there is no possibility to legally deport people to Afghanistan, right? So I think this is a really important thing to highlight as well. But with the gender aspect, yes, I think that also there are more vulnerabilities or possible why people are vulnerable, not just because of gender, but also because of family status, because of health, also because of sexual orientation and so forth. There are really many aspects why for some people these journeys are much more difficult to navigate than for others. So first of all, if you're doing this crazy trek across the mountains with a family with a small baby, for example, with a lack of food, lack of water, you're walking for days or for weeks, you're waiting in different houses organized by local smugglers, often in very poor conditions. This is definitely much more tougher than for a man, for example, who travels without a family. Right. But one aspect I really want to point to is that whilst refugees are moving, their experiences of violence do not end. It's quite opposite, actually, because, for example, during the pushbacks, there have been different allegations that state authorities were attacking people as a deterrent tool to show them to not really come back and deter their movement and their possibility in the future, plans or motivations to come back. So during these attacks by state authorities, I encountered men be more likely to be subjected to direct violence by state authorities, while women and children, they were spared. However, when we are shifting the focus to smugglers, because, this paradox, more pushbacks, more state violence, more border protection, smuggling is rising. Although often the arguments behind these policies is to fight cross-border crime, including human smuggling. But actually, the smuggling prices are increasing when it's more difficult and dangerous to cross the border, as Magdalena suggested. And so people are more reliant on smugglers, and often at the Iran-Turkey border, smugglers kidnap refugees to extort money from them and to demand more money that has been agreed previously. But also women especially are more likely to experience sexual violence, sexual abuse, and also sexual slavery. Within my interviews with some of the refugees, they said, the women, that, for example, they were kidnapped by their smuggler, and after they were sex slaves for several months. And they were raped by several men before managing to escape. So I think generally women in war conflicts as well are subjected more to sexual violence. And this is something that we have observed also at the EU's physical borders, for example, in Croatia. But I think that this gender aspect is quite important. But another thing is that if you have different sexual orientation for people who are LGBTQ plus, of course, even when they arrive in Turkey, I met one lesbian Hazara Afghan refugee in Van who said to me that she was really scared to say to Turkish authorities her sexual orientation because she has heard many stories of different medical checks to test her sexual orientations, inappropriate medical checks, but also very uncomfortable interrogation. And so she was very scared to say her sexual orientation. So I think these are some major, really vulnerabilities that I could highlight that are in my mind right now.
Thank you, Karolina. It's really hard to digest all of the issues that we're talking about at the moment. But also, Magdalena, you were talking about the international organizations on the ground, and people are not really. The economic situation in Afghanistan is really in crisis at the moment. The banks are collapsed, and there's no international aid because they are reluctant to give the current government money at the moment. And how do you see Taliban coping with this? What would be their regional or international policies in terms of coping with all of these challenges that they are at the time facing?
I mean, I think the challenge for the Taliban is, as I said, the transition. They were quite successful in sustaining their own operations through a number of years where they were under a lot of pressure by, of course, being involved in the drug trade, but also very aggressive taxation from the areas they controlled. But now they have to provide, of course, for much more people and much more complicated services. I mean, there are reports that Afghanistan could basically go dark because the Taliban cannot afford the country's electricity bill, if you can say it that simple. So that's a huge challenge for the Taliban. The question is, what will the Taliban choose a different strategy? Right now, it does not give the impression. If I can say it like this, the previous government strategy was basically transforming, with the support, active support of the international community, Afghanistan into a rentier state that was basically generating income by international funds. The private sector was really small, negligible in its contribution to the country's wealth. So almost all jobs were dependent on international grants, international funds. The security sector was nearly 100% funded by external revenues. The only money that the government really made was like border customs. And that is now one of the only sources that the Taliban have. As I said, like the reserves that the Afghanistan central bank had are outside of the country and right now frozen. And of course, they start taxing. They also approached international organizations for registering and certainly also taxation. But there is not much to pick up if the people are in an economic situation where they don't have anything to give and the Taliban cannot squeeze it out. So my read is a bit by what the Taliban did in the previous years. And in 2020, February, they also had an agreement with the US government that explicitly called for the continuation of development cooperation between the Taliban government and the US after the US withdrawal. So to me, it seems that they're emulating the same strategy. They're trying to get support from the external world. First of all, they talk to a lot of regional actors, but certainly there is an expectation, even explicit to the EU, but also to Germany and other players, that they should continue basically the old strategy, and that is supporting Afghanistan with aid, and there wouldn't be a difference whether it's the Islamic Republic or the Islamic Emirates. Of course, the majority of the donors is not really buying this. There is so far not a readiness from the big donors to go back to business as usual, and that's a problem for the Taliban. So they cannot really enforce the international recognition. But without international recognition, the money is not flowing, and that's a problem for the Taliban. And it could even be a problem reaching regime survival if the desperation of the people is so high. I think right now that's not the case because unfortunately most Afghans are used to being really poor. Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries despite all the development aid paid in the past years. But of course it's a risk for the Taliban that they try to overcome. But for this, they need to make amends with the funders of the old government, and that's especially the Western states. And I think that's a real problem right now that even we have and many international organizations who are in the country, that we're facing a bit also of a limbo. A lot of countries, a lot of organizations who are dependent on, who are funded through humanitarian aid. There was an international conference committing a lot of money to ongoing support to humanitarian aid, but they also don't know what will be the future of our staff and how long will donors actually support Afghanistan. Can we encourage our people who might also want to leave to stay? But if we can't tell them if they have a job next year, maybe they will also leave to a better place. And that would be like on top of an already quite dramatic brain drain that we saw in the past years. But the problem for international organizations like the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, but also many others, who get funded through development cooperation, that right now it's suspended. So we don't know actually if we're going to be able to operate in the next year. And we cannot really make any commitments to anyone. We cannot sign contracts. We cannot bring money into Afghanistan. And that's, of course, another layer of uncertainty. While the Western world, as it seems so far, is quite busy with evaluating and discussing the past and lessons learned, there is not much of a push on the future of our policy towards Afghanistan. Of course, there's still the discussion regarding evacuation of nationals, and as Karolina also said, the people that work with our organizations. But so far, that's, I think, the biggest part of the discussion that internationals had with the Taliban. And I think that's pretty difficult if we turn our backs and say, we're now done with Afghanistan and we now want to reconcile and close the chapter. We put the people in that country in a really, really difficult decision. So I think there is a wisdom needed by European policymakers, by US policymakers, to actually re-engage and at least formulate the conditions and disengage the Taliban on the process. I said before, there is a caretaker government, but there is no clear process on how this government could actually become a real government. We have not seen the inclusion of their former enemies, so to say. There is no reconciliation process. There is no parliament left that could authorize a new government. So it's basically, a government in open air. And we urgently need to work with Afghan stakeholders to bring this back on track, not only to have embassies that Afghans abroad can turn to for a passport, but also to be able to engage for the future of Afghans. And doing this without making like terrible compromises on saying we want to deport, and this is why we recognize the Taliban no matter what. But I think it's really, really important that we start this conversation and not get stuck in the past of the 20 years war.
Well, thank you very much, Magdalena, for highlighting the situation and the importance of the continuation within this uncertainty. Karolina, what can you say when you look at it from the macro aspect in terms of EU's externalization policies and the impact of maybe the previous statement on how Turkey is dealing with refugees? What are your comments on EU's role in this?
Yeah, this is a really important question because what's happening in Turkey within the migration management nationally is dependent on what's happening with migration management internationally, especially between Turkey and the EU as a major partner in externalization policies. So I just want to highlight something that I maybe should state it at the beginning. When Afghan refugees come to Turkey, they're not entitled to seek asylum, which is only available for European nationals. They're not able to seek temporary protection, which is a special status given to Syrian refugees, but they have to seek international protection. However, this international protection is something temporary. So they're able to apply for it. And if it's successful, they have to wait in Turkey to be resettled by third states, which are major America, Canada, but also the EU member states. But the problem is that Turkey has not received too many opportunities to resettle Afghans. So these people who are already right now in Turkey, right? So some of them I met in Van, they said to be waiting between 5 to 10 years in Turkey to be resettled with no response, like where even they are going to be resettled. And the problem is that refugees in Turkey right now, Afghans whose international protection status was accepted, they said that they have access to 1 year of health insurance, of healthcare. Most of them, they don't have access to education. Some of them, yes, but it's kind of about luck. And none of them have access to work legally. So out of the fear that more Afghans would overstay, especially now when there is a fear that more Afghans will be arriving, and even before, Turkey is toughening up its migration approach, right? And this has been observed since 2018, when there has been a huge centralization of migration management in Turkey. One of the most primary aspects of that, for example, was that before 2018, UNHCR was responsible about assessment of international protection, including of Afghans. After in 2018, this responsibility was redelegated to the Turkish Ministry of Interior. And within this change, we could observe over 92% of decline of positive results of international protections and boom of deportations. But to be able to deport people back then, the EU funds allowed Turkey to refurbish and open more removal centers. It was from 10 to 26 removal centers opened. And right now, when there is no possibility to deport people to Afghanistan, so what happens right now? And when the EU continues calling for externalization, of course, Turkey contracts. So we cannot really blame Turkish authorities solely about pushbacks or about responses to Afghan migration, because there is something that is dependent on the cooperation, right? And the EU proposed to give Turkey more 3 billion euros, and also to support Afghan refugees in Turkey. However, this is something that, of course, the ruling Justice and Development Party doesn't necessarily want, because it's at risk of losing its voters as well. So I think that this international and national really cooperates, or it's dependent on each other. Another thing is that during the deal in 2016, there has been, again, focus on Western borders, on Syrian refugees, and the tremendous aid that has been given to Syrian refugees within this deal. However, there has been also some funds from the EU that went to the border protections and building of removal centers in eastern Turkey. So, for example, the EU funds, especially the accession assistance, dedicated quite a lot of money to support border civilians in eastern Turkey, but also to support training of border guards. And also the Turkish Ministry of Interior claims that EU supported a building of the concrete wall along the border between Turkey and Iran with 110 million euros. So this is a kind of significant support, right? However, the European Commission has criticized Turkey for its fight against terrorism, especially along its border with Iraq and Iran, and in southeastern regions, Kurdish populated regions. So in the report, in some of the reports on Turkey by the European Commission, the Commission argues that there has been a broad interpretation of anti-terror measures, who actually terrorists is, and leading to arbitrary arrests, but also torture of civilians in eastern Turkey. And one of the part of the deal was call on Turkey to change the anti-terror laws and laws about terrorism in Turkey. However, this has been ignored, and the fight against terrorism continues. And although Turkey has the right to fight terrorism, of course, on its territory, it has been criticized. And here you can see very pragmatic anti-migration approach from the EU side, basically externalizing policies into the zone. At the same time, it criticizes for its military measures to stop migrants coming to the EU. So during the interviews with one member of the EU Parliament, she basically said that everything is better than migrants coming to the EU. And this is something that, at the end of the day, the refugees are in the middle of bargaining and at the middle of using refugees as a power tool, who will gain more political and financial benefits, right? On both sides, I would say. Yes.
Thank you very much for these points, Karolina. Maybe we can just move on to our final round and final remarks for a few minutes. Magdalena, you can also comment on what Karolina has been saying, and maybe tell us about how to move forward with the responses to migration with respect to human rights of Afghans and their rights of protection. And so what would be your comments for future? Magdalena, you have the floor.
Yeah, first of all, I'm really excited that FAS and me are working with Karolina actually on this issue as well. So here the IPC network has helped, I think, us as a foundation also to discover something that's quite well learned for our work. And what we want to look at is whether the Turkey story that Karolina just told, whether that is actually also taking place in other countries, because it's the same or similar situation. I think I found it quite strong what Karolina said. The message is everything is better than refugees. We have seen, maybe as a half joke, already conversations between the Austrian government and the Taliban over, well, recognition in exchange for refugees. And that's, I think, also a bit of the message that the EU is sending to other transit states, especially Iran, but also to Pakistan, to the Central Asian states, where we have high-ranking politicians traveling there, discussing resettlement, that they might not be able to hold promises on this, just as Karolina said. There's a lot of concern in the transit states to be transit or even becoming countries of destination and not getting, so to say, in this very dehumanizing discourse, to not getting rid of these people. We have seen the same discussion in Iran, in Pakistan, where there is at least a feeling among the leadership that they cannot afford to let more people in, and it cannot be compensated only by money from the European Union. So if we want to have resettlement policies with these countries, and I have the impression that this is already how the EU is preparing to prevent another 2015, whatever that actually means. So far, they're following the same strategies, like giving out, especially money, giving out, turning the other way on pushbacks, and basically encouraging behavior by these states that they would publicly criticize, but secretly empower and reward, and all that, of course, to the detriment of the Afghans who will suffer from it. So there needs to be much more honest discussion about the needs of host communities. Of course, we have leaders that might be willing and interested to take money and recognition and another high-level visit that makes them look good, but they face domestic pressures. Iran, Pakistan, they face a lot of economic uncertainties, so there might not be a welcoming environment, and a joint culture or something like this, we saw that in Turkey, cannot temper over it. And that is something that the EU has to openly address while emulating something that has extreme risks. The EU-Turkey deal has a lot of risks for people seeking protection inside Turkey, and that will not be different in other states. So I think that is something that the EU could use, as I said, as like a model when thinking about migration from Afghanistan in a broader way. But it should learn the right lessons. And I feel so far from at least what Karolina said, it doesn't give the impression that the EU has learned the right lessons to actually develop policies that do not go to the harming of people seeking protection, but that means increasing resettlement quotas to the European Union and not letting people basically wait for years on an empty promise.
Thank you very much. Karolina?
Yeah, so, well, there are many suggestions, right? But we have to pick some of the most crucial, of course. But I think following the issue of pushbacks, I think that if people cross to Turkey, like one of their basic rights is the access to international protection or to some kind of form of legal protection and their stay before being resettled, right? I think that Magdalena knows much more than me that the primary focus should be, of course, addressing root causes of migration in Afghanistan. Of course, this is quite challenging with the Taliban being in power and how the communication between the Taliban and the West and other countries will look like. However, now I'm talking more about what should be addressed when people are moving. So the access to protection is the number one priority, of course. And while the EU has dedicated quite a lot of money for example, improving material conditions in removal centers, what has not been really addressed is the access to legal protection and prevention of people being forced over border or before deported back to Afghanistan. I think that there should be definitely much more cooperation between NGOs, grassroots organizations with the Turkish Ministry of Interior and especially the Migration Directorate who manages the removal centers and accommodations and manages migration in Turkey. Especially, there should be more access for people to lawyers, the bar associations who are following the human rights violations and who can allow people and help them to access protection status. But for this to happen, there has to be international cooperation, especially in a sense there should be more resettlement, that Turkish government is not pressured to get rid of refugees because they know that the refugees will leave, and of course they will also go to other countries. They will not stay in Turkey and they will not bear the only responsibility over Afghan refugees. I think the another point is to move migration management from this huge securitization that we've been observing since 2015, when all people who are crossing the border are automatically treated as a potential threat, as a potential or illegal migrants or a security threat, terrorists, and so on. And they are responded to by really tough policies. And because, especially as I said at the beginning, we have to always remember this, that Afghans, most of them, they don't have access to legal and safe pathways. So they have to illegally cross the border to be able to arrive in a destination and legalize their status upon their arrival. So this should be bear in mind when responding to migration at the borders. And also the pushbacks, of course, should stop, especially to Iran, because this goes against the principle of non-refoulement, because many refugees said that they encountered physical violence, torture, but also killings by the Iranian border patrols, but also national Iranian police. So it's not really safe for refugees to be pushed back to the mountainous region in extreme weather where they face persecutions or violence by the Iranian authorities. And the last thing is that within the EU-Turkey talks, I think that the Commission and member states should be very careful about moving or externalizing migration and border policies to the area or zone, the military zone, which they criticize at the same time. So really what should be at the center of the EU-Turkey should be, okay, Turkey should also move further away from its authoritarian tendencies and very unacceptable anti-terror measures that also target civilians and possibly refugees crossing the border as a part of the future deals and negotiations and further fundings and resettlement schemes and so on. So I think that the Commission and member states should be very careful about how they are going to externalize or whether they will externalize policies and where, and they should also focus on their internal border and migration management rather than only external one.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Karolina Augustova, Magdalena Kirchner, for being with us today. in talking about Afghanistan in transition and its implications for Turkey. Thank you, our viewers, for watching us, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
you.
Bye-bye. Have a
Thank you
nice
so
day.
much.
Bye.
Türkiye'nin sivil, bağımsız, özgür ve çoğulcu bir medya ortamına ihtiyacı var. Medyascope, 20 Ağustos 2015'te bu ihtiyacı karşılamak üzere yola çıktı. Ama yolumuz uzun. Bu yolculukta bize Patreon veya YouTube'un katıl butonu üzerinden katkıda bulunabilirsiniz. Destek verin, sizinle güçlenelim.